Well, in an unusual move, the Liberal government is taking legal action to prevent the release of documents, and the Speaker of the House of Commons is named as the respondent. It's all over two scientists who were fired by the Public Health Agency of Canada. Now, the husband and wife worked at the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg, and they were escorted off the premises in 2019 and finally fired in January of this year. Earlier this month, opposition parties voted to demand documents related to the firings be handed over. And when the Public Health Agency refused, it was held in contempt of Parliament. Last week, the Liberal government filed a court motion to block the release of the documents, and Speaker Anthony Rota is named as the respondent on behalf of the House of Commons. Rota says he will fight that order, arguing the legal system does not have jurisdiction over the operations of the House of Commons. There's a lot going on there, so joining me now is constitutional expert Philippe Lagassé. Professor Lagassé, thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.
In your view, how did we get to this point, that the government is suing the Speaker of the House of Commons, essentially?
Well, it's a tough one, David. I mean, really, we're talking about a national security issue. And normally, that kind of information is not provided in a parliamentary setting, simply because parliamentarians don't, as a matter of course, have security clearances. Most members of committees don't either. And there was a compromise that was put in place a few years ago where we would have a committee of the executive made up of parliamentarians that would receive this information. But as we're seeing in a minority parliament situation, the House of Commons has the power to demand any documents it wants. And so when the opposition controls those powers, it can make those demands, request those documents. And as the Speaker ruled, that power is considered absolute. Now the government is turning to a very interesting interpretation of the limits of that power, and we'll see what the courts have to say about it.
What's at stake here, do you think, in this battle over the rights of Parliament?
Well, it comes down to the fundamental question of whether or not the legislature can fully hold the executive to account. And fundamentally, if the executive is in a position to decide what documents the legislature, the House of Commons and the Senate can or cannot have in its efforts to hold the government to account, then effectively we're allowing the executive to determine how it's being held to account. And that simply can't stand in a system such as ours, which ultimately depends on the ability of the Houses of Parliament to hold governments to account using all the powers that are afforded to Parliament, and that includes being able to call whatever witness they want, and in this case, being able to get any documents that it wants, including those that may touch on matters of national security.
You mentioned a committee and a compromise earlier. That was the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. That's MPs and senators who get national security level clearance so they can see these documents. This was the place where the documents could have gone unredacted to be looked at. Was that a reasonable compromise in your view?
I think it was a reasonable compromise. The difficulty is that NSICOP, so that committee that you mentioned, is formally part of the executive, and formally its reports go to the Prime Minister first. The Prime Minister then has the ability to redact them before tabling them before Parliament. And that's a fairly protracted process as well. These reports take time, and ultimately, as you might imagine, with an election looming, the opposition parties aren't particularly keen to accept that compromise in this case. They control the powers of Parliament, and therefore what incentive do they have to allow this to be sent to an executive review body, albeit one or with members who are parliamentarians? But why would they want to allow that committee to basically study this issue for a few years and then ultimately release a report that's redacted by the Prime Minister? So it's, as you might imagine, from the opposition's point of view, that's not an acceptable compromise, particularly in a minority situation.
You know, the government's argument, though, is that the lack of compromise would compromise national security potential. And is it reasonable to assert parliamentary supremacy if it damages the national security of the country?
I think, as has been ruled in the past, we saw this with the Afghan detainee controversy as well. Compromise is always the best option here. There is really an understanding that's supposed to exist that although Parliament and the House of Parliament can request any documents that they wish, that you shouldn't allow matters of national security to be disclosed in an unclassified situation, and that members of Parliament shouldn't speak about matters of national security that are classified. Now, in the past, we've come up with different compromises around this, and the law clerks of the committees have claimed that they should be the ones, at the very least, doing the redacting. Maybe that's an acceptable compromise. But whatever that compromise is, we've clearly reached a point where neither party is willing to budge, and it's an important principle in this case. Leaving aside whatever may be in those documents, we have to recognize that the executive cannot be the one that decides how it is held to account.
Well, in the short term, the courts will make some sort of a decision. I mean, what is your sense on the chances that the government's argument could succeed here?
I'm fairly skeptical that the government's argument will succeed, particularly if it tries to make it a national security issue. That is not really something that we've seen that might engage some limitation on privilege. Had they made it a question of the privacy of the individuals involved, or perhaps their charter rights, they might have had a very slim chance of making the case, and maybe that's still what they'll pursue. But on matters of national security, I have difficulty with the courts finding that the privileges of Parliament are limited by that.
It's a tough precedent either way, right? Because if the courts were to side with the government and put this constraint on Parliament, that would have far-reaching implications. But if there is no compromise and these documents are released in a way that does damage the national security of the country, or because Canada tends to receive intelligence information from other countries, there is a tremendous amount at risk here, depending on how this goes. If everyone doesn't come to their senses and find some sort of compromise, as you said, would probably be the best outcome here.
No, absolutely, David. Look, there should be a compromise that's found. NSI COP right now is probably the best solution. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, with an election looming and an effort to try and get this information out sooner rather than later, the official opposition doesn't really have any political incentive to go down that route. And similarly, you can't help but feel that from the government's point of view, if they can just stall this and in hopes that an election is underway and carried by the government, by the time this resurfaces, it will be a dead letter.
The Conservatives have actually quit the NSI COP, that committee. They announced that they would be leaving, at least all their MPs would be. I mean, based on that and based on where we are in the political cycle and the stakes of this and where we are, I mean, how optimistic are you that some sort of a compromise can be reached here? It doesn't seem like one is at play.
I remain hopeful, to be frank. I think ultimately there is an understanding that this is a sensitive issue, that there's likely information within these documents that is secretive and sensitive and injurious to Canadian national security if it is released. Therefore, even if the government ultimately and the courts accept that Parliament or the House of Commons can demand these documents, that a compromise will still be available. As we saw, again, in the Afghan detainee case, ultimately it was found that Parliament was able to get access to all those documents, but some compromise was put in place so that they could be reviewed without releasing the information within them. So ultimately, I think a compromise is possible here. Let us hope that cooler heads prevail.
Okay, it's complicated stuff. You made it very clear. Professor Philippe Lagassé, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.